From KVUE News in Austin, you're watching Texas This Week with Ashley Goudeau.
Good Sunday morning and happy Mother's Day. In this week's edition of Texas This Week, the end of a Trump-era pause on Medicaid renewals led states to start unenrolling Medicaid recipients, and Texas kicked off more children than any other state in the nation. Plus, a South Texas congressman indicted on federal charges, and some of his staffers are already cutting plea deals with the federal government. More on those stories in just a minute, but first, let's get to the three things you need to know in Texas politics. Speaker of the Texas House Dade Phelan handed down his interim charges this week, telling state representatives what issues he wants them to study before the start of the next legislative session. And a controversial policy made the list: education savings accounts. ESAs, or school vouchers, drove a wedge between the Texas GOP last session, leading Governor Greg Abbott to campaign against the rural Republicans who oppose the idea of allowing families to use taxpayer dollars to send their children to private schools. Governor Greg Abbott is telling public colleges and universities to ignore the Title IX rewrite. Title IX protects students against sex-based discrimination. Last month, the Biden administration expanded sex to include gender identity. Governor Abbott says the change will destroy the legacy of women's sports. 3 weeks after the first pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested on a UT campus, we are hearing from university leaders. During the Board of Regents meeting Wednesday, the chair defended the response.
Many have questioned the use of law enforcement from outside agencies. To be clear, no president in the UT system made those decisions on their own. The chancellor and I and this board are always involved in those decisions. They were the right decision, and we will do it again if needed.
After a 3-year pause, states across the country started Medicaid renewals last year. By the end of the year, more than 4 million fewer children were enrolled in Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. And Texas had the most children removed from Medicaid. These findings are the work of a team of researchers at the Georgetown University Center for Children and Families. Joan Alker, executive director of the center, joined me to talk about the impacts of the Medicaid unwinding. First, tell us what prompted the Center for Children and Families at Georgetown University to look into the Medicaid unwinding.
Yes, so Medicaid has become such an important source of health insurance for the nation's children, covering almost half of our children in this country. So we knew that after the pandemic, when states had to check eligibility for all these kids, that this was going to be a really important time period for children.
Did the eligibility change, or was there something else that prompted the unenrollment of all these kids?
Yeah, great question. So during the pandemic, Congress enacted with the signature of President Trump a protection for everybody on Medicaid. During the pandemic period, they couldn't be disenrolled unless, of course, they raised their hand and wanted to be disenrolled. And that was because we had an economic crisis up front, and of course, we had a health crisis. We were in a pandemic. So after the public health emergency ended, states had to go in and check eligibility for everybody on Medicaid. And some states have done this very carefully. Other states, not so much. They've been very hasty, and particularly when we're talking about children, most of them remain eligible for Medicaid, but unfortunately in states like Texas, many have lost their Medicaid coverage during this time period.
Yeah, we're talking about many. Your team found that millions of children were unenrolled, and Texas really leading the nation in the number of children that were removed from the program.
That's right. We found in 2023 that over 4 million fewer children were enrolled in Medicaid, and over 1 million of those children live in Texas. So Texas has by far the largest number of children that have lost Medicaid. Florida comes in next. But unfortunately, Texas has been really leading the nation in this metric that nobody wants to lead the nation in. So I'm extremely worried about kids and families in Texas.
Talk to us about the real life impacts of what happens when these children lose their medical coverage.
Yeah, so it's really a problem for children to have any gap in their coverage. Children are not using care just for the fun of it. When they go to the doctor, they're either getting well child checkups, they're getting immunizations, or they're sick. And we want all of those kinds of visits to occur. So if children have any gap in coverage, that's a problem. Think about a story I've heard many times in this unwinding process from pediatricians. You have lots of kids who have asthma, and asthma is a treatable condition. As long as you can see the doctor and you can get your medication, you can get your inhalers. But kids who can't access their medication because they're uninsured and they're very expensive wind up in the emergency room. And the family is left with a large medical bill. And I've heard that story numerous times. The kid misses school, they fall behind, the family has a large medical debt. And all this can happen very quickly for a child because things happen all the time. You know, kids are not expensive for our society to cover, but they do use regular care and they need to be able to access that regular care.
South Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar and his wife are facing multiple charges for allegedly accepting $600,000 in bribes. Federal investigators filed those charges last week, and this week, two of the congressman's political consultants agreed to plead guilty to conspiring with him. Scott Braddock, editor of Harvey Kronberg's Quorum report, joined me to talk about the allegations and political implications. Last week, a federal indictment against Texas Congressman Henry Cuellar was unsealed. Tell us all about what it alleges he has done.
You know, according to his own lawyers, it sounds like something from a spy thriller novel. This idea that you have the Azerbaijan government involved and an oil company there involved, funneling money to him and supposedly being funneled through middlemen who then, put the money through a bank in Mexico, and somehow it ends up in the congressman's wife's account. His lawyers say this is all false, it's all made up, and he's going to fight the charges. But it is serious stuff, and I was talking to some veterans of the Texas Capitol who actually, used to interact with Congressman Cuellar when he was a state representative years ago, earlier in his career. A couple things. They said, one, that they think, look, he's going to prison. This is pretty ironclad, what's in the federal indictment, and not just that, but the plea agreements from two people who worked for the congressman, including his top political strategist for many years. And the other thing that they said was that you have to go back to the late 80s, early 90s for an indictment of a sitting politician in Texas where you get to six figures being, part of the deal. We're talking about more than $600,000, at least $200,000 that ended up in at least one of the accounts.
Wow. For viewers who may not be as familiar with him, tell us a little bit about the congressman and frankly, how powerful he is in Washington.
He really is. He's one of the point people for the Democratic leadership. Speaker Pelosi, when she was the speaker and then the leader, would often, support Congressman Cuellar in South Texas, even though he's a very conservative Democrat. He is right now the last pro-life Democrat in the U.S. House, and the liberal leadership of the Democratic Party would still back him up because he was somebody who really brought a lot to the fold for them in Washington. He's been not without controversy, as I said. As a conservative Democrat, it's kind of an endangered thing, but he's been able to navigate his elections over the years, and he won a couple of years ago a primary against a very progressive challenger. It was very narrow. You might remember there was a recount. I think he won by a little less than 300 votes in this giant district that goes from Laredo up to San Antonio. He's a survivor, I'll say it that way, politically, but his legal future definitely in question.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit more about that. You alluded to that. This week, two of his political consultants agreed to plead guilty to say that they conspired with him, and yet he's still holding steady, saying that he and his wife are innocent. In fact, he released a statement kind of saying, I've done nothing that other politicians haven't done, for the welfare of the American people. It's
what you have to say when you're a politician under indictment is that this is, quote, all political. They're all going to say that. Think about what Ken Paxton said when he was going through an impeachment and, at least one indictment and prosecution. There could be a federal prosecution of Paxton as well. Put a pin in that. We may come back to that. But these guys, whether Republican or Democrat, they're always going to say that whatever's being done against them is political. In this case, it's interesting. It's the Department of Justice under a Democratic president that has indicted a Democrat in Congress. It's a little harder to make the case that it's your own party that's going after you for some political reason, although with Paxton that was the case, right? He kept saying that the people coming after me are the, quote, liberal Republicans. And in this case, Cuellar and his folks, Cuellar being more conservative, he's going to be making the case it's the more liberal Democrats who are out to get him.
You can read more about the charges the congressman is facing at KVUE.com. That's Texas This Week.